Good morning, everyone. We're about to get started. District Attorney Andrew Murray is going to lead a presentation and discuss this case in detail. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, so we ask that you hold your questions until that time. When we reach Q&A, please simply just raise your hand, and I'll call on you so that no one has to talk over one another. With that, I'd like to introduce District Attorney Andrew Murray.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I apologize for being late. My meeting before this took a little longer than expected. We're here to discuss a tragic case. First, my deepest sympathies go to the Scott family. I extend my heartfelt prayers to Mrs. Scott and her children. This morning, I got the opportunity to meet with Mrs. Scott and her sister to extend my condolences personally and to go over in detail all the evidence in this case, and to also discuss our legal analysis that my prosecutors and I went through to make the decision that we made. As you can imagine, it was a difficult discussion. However, the family was extremely gracious. No one, and I mean no one, should ever experience, let alone witness, the violent death of a loved one. Confrontations between police and citizens in which deadly force is used are among the most important cases my office will ever handle. We have a duty to objectively analyze the totality of evidence and circumstances, and that means we must face difficult issues, which we'll discuss today. But it's important that during this process, we, prosecutors and the public alike, never lose sight of the fact that a family is grieving. At the end of our discussion today, a detailed report will be published on our website so it is available to the public, and obviously you. I'd like to share information from that report, and I'll start by describing how my office undertakes the review of any fatal officer shooting. In these cases, my office uses a protocol that incorporates nationally recognized best practices and is designed to ensure a thorough and impartial review of each case. Anytime someone is killed by an officer working in the line of duty, a representative from my office reports to the scene and monitors the investigation. In this case, 2 of my most senior prosecutors responded to the scene. We are given complete access to every part of the investigation. When the investigation is complete and the law enforcement agency has turned over its investigative file, the case is presented to my homicide team, which analyzes evidence piece by piece and considers how state law would apply to the case. Then the group makes a recommendation to me as to whether or not charges should be sought. In the final step, I personally and thoroughly review the entire file. I can tell you that in this case, I thought it was important enough to have additional senior attorneys weigh in. So my executive team and my previous homicide team members joined the present homicide team for this review, bringing together a group of about 15 career prosecutors. Their recommendation was unanimous. That bears repeating. 15 career prosecutors, and their recommendation was unanimous. The laws that must be considered in these cases revolve around self-defense. Under state law, an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm allows someone to respond in such a way as to negate or stop the threat. The same legal standards apply to both private citizens and police officers. The only difference is that by the nature of the work they are asked to do on behalf of the community, police are sometimes required to run toward rather than run away from dangerous situations in order to protect the public. Several federal civil court rulings are instructive in cases of officer-involved shootings. Essentially, the law says we have to determine whether it was reasonable for the officer to believe he needed to use deadly force. The U.S. Supreme Court found that this reasonableness must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision of hindsight. And that this reasonableness must allow for the fact that police are often forced to make split-second decisions in rapidly evolving situations. The courts also say that the Constitution does not require police officers to wait until a subject shoots to confirm that a serious threat of harm exists. I'm now going to discuss the timeline events and the provable facts. On September 20th, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department officers Vinson and Sergeant Pendergraft were conducting surveillance at an apartment complex off Old Concord Road to locate a person who is not related to this case. Officer Vinson parked his unmarked van in the complex parking lot with Sergeant Pendergraft concealed in the back. Because both were working undercover, they were in plain clothes. Basically, the officers in a van pull nose forward into a visitor spot. Sergeant Pendergraft is in the back, hidden with tinted windows. Officer Vinson is driving. While conducting this surveillance, Mr. Scott parked his white SUV close to the van. Officer Vinson saw Mr. Scott exit the SUV and walk past the van. Officer Vinson said it appeared as though he was trying to look into the van's tinted windows. At that point, Officer Vinson was concerned that their cover may have been blown. But Mr. Scott got back into his SUV and drove away. The officers remained in the unmarked van. We now know at this point Mr. Scott went to a nearby convenience store. Investigators later discovered a time-stamped receipt in his SUV that led them to the store, where they found surveillance footage showing that Mr. Scott parked outside and then entered the store. I'm about to show you a video of Mr. Scott parking directly in front of the store and then stepping and walking into the store. I'm going to call your attention to his right ankle as he goes to close the door that does not close immediately. Again, I can't find the slide. Oh. So this is Mr. Scott pulling up in his white SUV. He gets out. The door doesn't always close. Please watch his right ankle as he turns to close his door, which will be on the right side of the screen. There. That's an isolated picture of that scene. The bulge you can see here is consistent with the holster and gun that was later described by officers and located at the scene. Within minutes, Mr. Scott returned to the apartment complex where he parked beside Officer Vinson's van. When he parked beside the vehicle, he backed in. So you have the police officer nosed in, you have him backing in with their driver's side doors close to each other. At that time, Mr. Scott opens his door, leans to the side, empties a cigarillo. For those of you who do not know what a cigarillo is, it's just a small cigar. Empties it and begins to put in marijuana from a pill bottle and roll it. The pill bottle of marijuana, blunt because it was smoked when it was later located, were recovered at the scene. At this time, the officers decided the marijuana did not warrant an interruption of their surveillance operation. Officer Vinson told investigators, and I quote, "We're not really worried about a little marijuana." That all changed when Officer Vinson saw Mr. Scott holding up a semi-automatic handgun as he sat in his vehicle. Officer Vinson told Sergeant Pendergraft what he had seen, and they decided to leave and come back with marked cars to make an arrest for the marijuana and further investigate the firearm. These observations are corroborated by both officers' statements, as well as a radio traffic in which Sergeant Pendergraft asked other officers to join them because they'd seen a man with drugs and a gun. I'm going to play you that radio traffic. It's here instead of on it. There you go. There it is. Your mouse was just there. This radio traffic is important because it corroborates the fact that officers saw Mr. Scott with a gun before any action was taken. Officer Vinson and Sergeant Pendergraft met nearby with Officer Miranda and Wiggins. They decided to return to the parking lot with their undercover vehicles, and they instructed Officer Hostetler to join them at the scene with a marked patrol vehicle. Officers Vinson, Miranda, Wiggins, and Sergeant Pendergraft were wearing plain clothes, and all four put on tactical vests. Officer Vinson's vest had his badge clearly displayed on the chest. The others had vests with the words police in bold letter completely across the chest. Officer Hostetler was in the marked unit and wore a typical police uniform. The officers had decided that Officer Vinson would use his unmarked van to pin Mr. Scott's vehicle into the parking space so that the SUV could not be driven away. After Officer Vinson parked his van in this manner, Officer Miranda, who was wearing a tactical vest as previously described, approached the passenger side of Mr. Scott's SUV. It was at this point that Officer Miranda says that he saw Mr. Scott reach for his ankle holster. Officer Miranda saw the butt of the gun sticking out of the holster. He yells, "Gun, gun," to his fellow officers. In his interview with investigators, Officer Miranda said that Mr. Scott looked at him and then pulled the gun out of the ankle holster. Officer Miranda began yelling, "Drop the gun, drop the gun." Officer Hostetler, he's the officer in uniform, ran to the SUV, in the regular uniform, ran to the SUV and tried to break the passenger side window with a baton. As he did this, he reported seeing Mr. Scott holding a gun in his right hand as he was seated in the SUV. After Officer Hostetler broke the window, Officer Miranda said he saw Mr. Scott take a deep breath and exit the SUV. Officers Vinson, Hostetler, Wiggins, and Sergeant Pendergraft all saw the gun in Mr. Scott's hand after exiting the vehicle. However, as everyone here is aware, none of the video recordings, the dash cam, the body-worn camera, or Mrs. Scott's cell phone video clearly capture Mr. Scott's hands. What is clearly captured on video is Mr. Scott's right ankle. When he exits the SUV, you can see that his right pant leg is pulled up above the ankle. This is the same spot where you can see a bulge in his pant leg in the convenience store surveillance footage, and the same place on his ankle where police recovered a holster following the shooting. Here, the bulge, the protrusion. Here, the ankle. goes along with Officer Miranda, who indicated you reach down, pulled it out. You see what appears to be a holster, and nothing to the left and right. Here you have a huge bulge. Also captured on all videos are the repeated commands from officers for Mr. Scott to drop the gun. Based on the dash cam video footage and Mrs. Scott's video, officers can be heard at least 10 times commanding Mr. Scott to drop the gun. The videos also show that Mr. Scott did not comply with those commands. In interviews, officers described Mr. Scott's behavior during this incident. Those descriptions included that he had a blank stare, as if he was in a trance-like state. This behavior is consistent with the known side effects of medication prescribed to Mr. Scott. Additional side effects are aggression and behavior abnormalities. I'm going to show you a picture of Officer Vinson and where he was in proximity to Mr. Scott when he exited the vehicle. This is from the body-worn camera of Officer Hustetler, who had broken the window. Officer Vinson here, just in what I will call the V, the white SUV of Mr. Scott, the police van that comes up and pins, Mr. Scott here, in close proximity across the car. There's been some speculation in the community. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed the slide. Officer Vinson could see that Mr. Scott continued to not comply with the officer's commands, and in his interview, he described the moment that he perceived that Mr. Scott posed an imminent threat. Mr. Scott looked at Vinson, then looked in the direction of each officer, and then looked back at Vinson. I'm going to play for you Officer Vinson's interview, this portion. So at this point, I'm going to take you through Officer Vinson did not know Mr. Scott. None of the officers knew Mr. Scott. None of them had had contact with Mr. Scott. But what did Officer Vinson know? Officer Vinson was aware that Mr. Scott had a gun in his vehicle. He was aware that he had marijuana in his vehicle. He was aware that when he pinned the car, that Mr. Scott chose to draw that weapon and had it in his hand. He was aware that after repeated commands, Mr. Scott did not obey those commands, acted with aberrant behavior, steps out of the vehicle with gun in hand, doesn't run, doesn't drop the gun, doesn't leave the gun in the car, but steps out and steps back, assessing each officer with a trance-like look described by Officer Vinson. Now, how about Mr. Scott at that point? Well, Officer Vinson did not know Mr. Scott, had not seen him. So unbeknownst to him, Mr. Scott was aware that he was a convicted felon with a gun, an illegal gun, and that he had warrants out from him in Gaston County, and that he had police officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, surrounding his vehicle. It's at this point that Officer Vinson fired his weapon 4 times, striking Mr. Scott in the wrist, abdomen, and rear shoulder. Despite officers and medical personnel's attempts to render aid, Mr. Scott unfortunately passed away. I'm going to show you a medical examiner, what the medical examiner did for us, and that is a what's the correct term, a silhouette, a mannequin where the ME put the trajectory of the bullets. Now we know that there were 4 shots because you hear 4 shots in rapid succession on the video. We also know it because Officer Vinson says that he fired. We also know it because there are 4 shell casings that are around in proximity to Officer Vinson. The medical examiner could not tell us the sequence of the projectiles. One in the wrist that we don't show. The one in the wrist is not what we call clear through and through, because there are pieces of the bullet that are in the wrist. The one in the abdomen goes into the abdomen, and the left side travels through and comes to rest at the spine, at the lower lumbar. The one in the upper shoulder travels from left to right and front to back. Begins at the shoulder, 7 inches from the midline of the back, travels down, through, and ends up at the abdomen at the front part. So there's been much speculation as the first shot being a shot in the back. The totality of the evidence does not come close to supporting that. The medical examiner can't say the sequence of the shootings, but if you look at where Officer Vinson was located, and then you look at the video, we can conclude that one of the shots before the shot in the shoulder was to the abdomen, causing Mr. Scott to keel over, causing a shot after to go through the shoulder and the trajectory that ends up in the front of the abdomen. There's been some speculation in the community regarding whether Mr. Scott was armed. I'd like to address those specific concerns. All of the credible and available evidence suggests that he was in fact armed. Here's the evidence that leads us to that conclusion. Prior to any action being taken, Officer Vinson told Sergeant Pendergraft that he saw Mr. Scott with a gun, and Sergeant Pendergraft relayed that information over the radio. That's the radio traffic you heard a few minutes ago. Every officer present reporting seeing Mr. Scott holding a gun. Officers can be heard on video repeatedly commanding Mr. Scott to drop the gun. The idea that Mr. Scott was unarmed does not explain why officers acted defensively, had their guns drawn, and ordered him to drop the gun. Everyone who has seen the video of the incident can feel the tension in that situation. According to Officer Wiggins, after Mr. Scott was shot, he fell to the ground and his gun landed near his waistline. Officer Wiggins said he moved the gun away from Mr. Scott and stood over the gun to ensure that it could not be accessed by Mr. Scott. On the dash cam video, on the dash camera, and Officer Hutler's body cam, Officer Wiggins is seen crouching down, reaching with one hand, and moving something from Mr. Scott. You do not see the ground. You see Officer Wiggins crouch down, his arm move, him step back and then stand there. Kind of unusually. Other officers start tending to Mr. Scott, and he is standing there awkwardly. In Mr. Scott's video, you can see an object. In Mrs. Scott's video, you can see an object between his feet in the same place where we see the firearm and body-worn camera footage from another officer who responded to the scene just after the shooting. He stands there. Mrs. Scott, you can see something. You don't know what it is. There's an officer comes up immediately afterwards with body cam. He is going. The officers tell him, clear the car. You can see him going to the cars to look to make sure there's nobody else in it. The cars are clear. And in his body cam, it's clearly depicted officer standing over the gun. Mr. Scott's DNA was found on the slide of the gun and on the grip of the gun. Let me say that again. His DNA was found on the slide of the gun and on the grip of the gun. Mr. Scott's fingerprint was found on the gun when it was examined by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Crime Lab. However, the state crime lab did not find that print to be of value, meaning they did not find it to be significant enough to be able to say it was Mr. Scott's. Now, there's a reason for that. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department uses a certain technology. They used that technology. They made the determination. When they send it to the State Bureau of Investigation, they send a disc along with a card that is a lower resolution card. The State Bureau of Investigation has different technology. It's like you sending me something to open on some great program you have, and I don't have it, I can't open it. So SBI had to look at the lower resolution, and they found they could not make a determination based on that. Mr. Scott's gun, a Colt 380 semi-automatic, was recovered at the scene. It had one round in the chamber, the safety was off, and the gun was cocked. There's his gun, safety off, cocked, and later examined to found a bullet live in the chamber. Investigators traced Mr. Scott's gun, which was stolen from a Gaston County home and then illegally sold to Mr. Scott on September 2nd. The seller admitted that he sold the gun to Mr. Scott, and a Facebook conversation between the seller and a third party corroborates this information. Basically, the seller saw what we all saw on the video of the incident that was being displayed and said, I know that guy, and I know that gun. I'm now going to show you excerpts from that conversation. He's talking to a third party, talking about what he saw on the TV. Through the report that will be released today, you'll be able to read the entire conversation between the seller and a third party. I will never sell another one. The hammer's cocked back. That's the seller. He had an ankle holster. I hope he wiped my prints off of it. Third party. Shit, me too. I can get time for that and they would burn me. Third party. I was really hoping it wouldn't be the one. But you know, I'm going to pray for the best on that for you, cuz. TY, I've learned, means thank you. I'm still hurt. I feel like it's my fault he is dead. The seller also revealed that he sold a holster to Mr. Scott with modifications that matched those found on the holster Mr. Scott was wearing. Here's the holster. He said he sold him the holster. He said he modified it. When he was shown the holster, he says, oh yeah, that's the cuts I made to make sure the gun was fit. The seller went to Gander Mountain with Mr. Scott on the same day he sold it, where Mr. Scott purchased a magazine and ammunition for the firearm. Agents located a computer transaction receipt for the magazine and ammunition, and the purchase was made with a debit card ending in the numbers that matched the debit card found in Mr. Scott's wallet. Text messages from Mr. Scott's phone show that on September 10th, he and the seller communicated about returning or exchanging a clip at Gander Mountain because the one he'd purchased was too short. It wasn't working in the gun. If you see the gun, it doesn't have a clip in it. .380 ammunition was located in Mr. Scott's vehicle inside a pack of cigarettes in the center console cup holder. In the center console, pack of cigarettes. This is them going through the vehicle. You can see the broken glass. Live rounds, .380 to fit the gun. A reading book was not found in the front or back seats of Mr. Scott's SUV. A composition notebook belonging to Mrs. Scott was found wedged between the center console and the front passenger seat. It did not match the description given by witnesses who claimed that they saw Mr. Scott with a book. I'd like to address erroneous claims that someone other than Officer Vinson shot Mr. Scott. First, Officer Vinson took responsibility for the shooting from the outset. Every officer's gun was seized, and an ammunition count was conducted by investigators. Each one had a full complement of ammunition with the exception of Officer Vinson, who was 4 rounds short of a full complement. In the videos, the sound of 4 rounds is clearly heard, and 4 shell casings were recovered at the scene. Each officer is issued a firearm with a unique serial number. Officer Vinson's gun, as well as the 4 shell casings, were sent to the lab for analysis. An expert firearms analyst found that the 4 shell casings were fired from Officer Vinson's gun. 9 civilian witnesses were interviewed by investigators. Some of these witnesses gave conflicting statements, as well as statements that are unsupported by video or physical evidence. 3 of these witnesses claimed on social media or in media interviews that Scott was unarmed, but the SBI later determined they had not actually seen the shooting. When they were interviewed by SBI later, they said they did not actually see the shootings, despite their claims on social media or with the media. One told reporters that she was an eyewitness and saw a white officer shoot Mr. Scott, and that Officer Vinson wasn't around at the time of the shooting. She later acknowledged to the SBI that she heard officers telling Mr. Scott to drop the gun, but she didn't see the shooting. Another told reporters that she saw Mr. Scott with his hands raised, step over a book that fell from his lap. Those statements are refuted by the video evidence, and she later told the SBI that she was in her apartment at the time of the shooting and didn't see Mr. Scott until after the shooting had occurred, and she never saw a book or a gun. A juvenile under the age of 16 told investigators that he saw the incident from his apartment. He initially told Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department that Mr. Scott was reading a book when officers tried to break his window. He said Mr. Scott put the book down and exited the SUV empty-handed with his hands wide open. In a later interview with SBI, he shared that information again and added that officers said they were going to tase Mr. Scott, and he was actually tased by police. He also said the officer did not say anything to Mr. Scott when he exited his vehicle, and that a white officer shot him. The physical evidence does not support those claims, and when questioned on some of these issues, this witness referenced someone's claim in a YouTube video, and it became apparent that he had incorporated information that he'd heard from other sources. Investigators also went to his home to examine his vantage point, and what they discovered is that it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to make those observations due to the obstruction of a tree and the positioning of Mr. Scott's SUV. Basically, from his apartment, there's a tree, and is the passenger side of Mr. Scott's vehicle. He would have had to see through the tree and through the passenger side to see anything occurring on the other side of the vehicle. 2 witnesses said they were inside a nearby home and watched the incident unfold. They heard the officer's commands to drop the gun. Both indicated they saw something in Mr. Scott's hand, but they could not identify the object. They had a view, but because of their distance, they say that he had something in his hand, but they can't say what was in his hand. Another witness was working in the area, heard the officer's shouts, but had turned away when the shots were fired. Now, Mrs. Scott has maintained that her husband was unarmed during the encounter. It's important to understand that we must consider her statements and weigh them along with all of the other evidence in this case. Charlotte-Mecklenburg detectives began to interview Mrs. Scott at the hospital on the evening of the shooting, but she ultimately terminated that interview on the advice of her attorney. She and her attorneys later publicly claimed that CMPD never attempted to interview her. Before that interview ended, she told CMPD that 4 white officers were present. All 4 fired their weapons, and there were no black officer present. The brief interview was captured on a body-worn camera. Later in the interview with CBS News, she stated that Officer Vinson, who is black, was present, but she did not believe he shot Mrs. Scott, or she did not believe he shot her husband, Mr. Scott, because he was not part of the action. Mrs. Scott did later meet with the SBI for an interview, and she provided valuable information about her husband's medications and their effects. She said that Mr. Scott had just taken his medicine and that those prescriptions make him zoned. Mrs. Scott has maintained in interviews with investigators and the media that Mr. Scott did not have a gun. She told the SBI that the last time she ever knew Scott to have any type of firearm was prior to his wreck in October of 2015, and that she was certain he did not have any guns after January of 2016. However, text messages between Mr. and Mrs. Scott the month before the shooting include an argument about a gun in Mr. Scott's possession. In the report that we're putting online, you'll find limited information regarding Mr. Scott's background and medical history. While he had a criminal history and was receiving treatment for psychiatric disorders, his history was unknown to Officer Vinson. In this case, it would be merely speculative to assess whether this history explained Mr. Scott's conduct on the day of the incident. In conclusion, after a thorough review and given the totality of the circumstances and credible evidence in this case, it is my opinion that Officer Vinson acted lawfully when he shot Mr. Scott. He acted lawfully. I am fully satisfied and entirely convinced that Officer Vinson's use of deadly force was lawful. The central issue here is whether Officer Vinson was lawful in using deadly force against Mr. Scott. Anyone is justified in using deadly force if he reasonably believed, and in fact believed, that he or someone else was in imminent danger of great bodily injury or death. We cannot know what Mr. Scott's intentions or reasoning were that day, and Officer Vinson could not know that at the time. What he saw was a man who had drawn a gun when confronted by police, exited a vehicle with a gun in hand, and failed to comply with officers who commanded him at least 10 times to put the gun down. When considering imminent threat, it's important to consider the science of response time and reaction time. The reality is that Mr. Scott could have raised his gun and killed Officer Vinson or another officer before any of them could have reacted to the threat. Reaction time studies dealing with the police shootings provide valuable insight for the analysis of this shooting, and these studies are cited in the report. Those studies show that in these scenarios, the result is a tie at best. Even officers in a position of ready, watching somebody, if they're armed with a gun to their side, by the time they do this, the reaction from officers has to be from the brain to the trigger finger, and the studies say it is tie at best. When considering, I think there's a misconception out there about the scope of the review in the DA's office. This office does not examine whether an officer followed CMPD directives or policies or whether the incident was handled appropriately from a tactical standpoint. In this case, the only determination this office is making is whether or not Officer Vinson acted in self-defense. Now I'd like to speak to the community. I know that some out there are going to be frustrated. I want everyone in this community to know that we meticulously, thoroughly reviewed all of the evidence in this case, made sure it was credible evidence in order to make the decision that we made today. We took a lot of painstaking effort to make certain that there was no personal bias in the review, and public opinion did not factor in our determination. I'd like the community to take a collective pause. The community should read the report, digest the report. Please do not act viscerally on news snippets. Read the report. In describing the legal analysis and the basis for the decision, in this case, my office and I unfortunately find ourselves in a position of correcting misinformation that has been shared both on social media and in the news media. People made claims on camera but later admitted to law enforcement that they didn't actually see the incident. People and the public might then ask themselves, why didn't you release more information to refute these untrue statements? I have always asserted that my office would strive towards transparency, but I need people to understand that among my highest priorities is also protecting the integrity of every investigation. That means responsible transparency. Responsible transparency. In an ongoing investigation, details are closely guarded to help measure the truthfulness of witnesses and, should someone be charged, preserve the defendant's right to fair trial. I know the lack of accurate information is frustrating to the public and the media that operates on a 24-hour news cycle. But in this age of instant media and the impulse to immediately form an opinion, I'm asking that as we move forward, we remind ourselves that in these cases, we should not jump to conclusions until we have all of the facts. In the days that followed Mr. Scott's death, we watched as long simmering frustrations boiled over. I heard observers say, this is not Charlotte. This is not the city that we love. But it is. This is Charlotte. This is where our friends, families, neighbors, and colleagues felt so passionate that they marched on our streets to call for change. Let me be clear. I have not and will not condone violence or property damage as a means of expression. But the fact that criminal charges are not appropriate under the law in this particular case does not mean we can dismiss the concerns expressed by those who raise their voices to raise the consciousness of this community. I think it's high time that all of us recognize that this is Charlotte, and not everyone experiences the same Charlotte. Throughout our entire justice system, people should have the same experience. The people of Mecklenburg County deserve the confidence that every case is handled with fairness and equity. I want this community to know that I would not hesitate to prosecute an officer whom evidence showed acted outside of the law. And in fact, we have. From assaults to DWIs to fraud to, unfortunately, sexual offenses. We have prosecuted officers. It is my sincere prayer that no one is ever killed by police. But I also pray that police are never placed in a position of having to make the decision to use lethal force to protect themselves or innocent lives around them. I welcome being part of the ongoing public discussion and exchange of ideas on how to improve our system so that all community members have complete confidence that they will be dealt with fairly and treated with respect. Justice demands nothing less. At this time, I'll take questions.
Murray, do you have any information on the specific kind of medication Mr. Scott was taking?
We do. I will just tell you that he was taking a significant number of drugs, and they were, for some of them, somewhat mind-altering.
Mr. Scott actually raised the gun at any point?
He did not raise the gun, to our knowledge, based on the video or any evidence from any of the statements of officers.
Yes, sir.
But I'm Reverend Johnson, and I just want to say I sat here and I listened to everything, and I accept that, what you said. You gave me the facts, and that's what we was acting for the fact. Only thing that bothers me, that why it takes so long to give these facts. You got folks out there, like you said, they have a different story. I sat down and I listened to what you said, and I saw the facts, and I would accept that facts, and I would take that back to my flock. But had y'all came forward with this information, you had to go. You saw when he went inside supposed to bring that to the public, and then it wouldn't have been a whole lot of protest. The truth shall set you free. And these folks that went to jail not to protest because they was hearing other evidence that this man didn't have no gun, but you know he had a gun, and we know it now. Why? Just tell them why we couldn't come early and this stuff wouldn't be happening.
Sir, as I stated, and I appreciate the question, an investigation has to unfold. When video gets out, individuals can comport, and in this case did, what they say they saw to a video. The investigation, what I'd ask is your community, your church, this entire community, to please just wait for the investigation. It takes a while. You have to get an investigation. We had to get analysis of the gun. The police did a good job in going out and finding where did that gun come from?
Yes, sir.
Where was it located? All of that investigation has to come to us, and then we have to evaluate. In this case, there were 63 SBI agents called in from around the state to do the investigation with over 2,300 hours of their time to do this investigation. That's a quarter of the entire SBI. That's how important this case was. That's the time to put on. But that doesn't happen overnight. So that's why I'm asking the community to take a collective pause. Next question.
So you said that he did not raise the gun. He had a wild look in his eye based on the medication. And it was difficult to hear the officer. But it sounds as though the bottom line here is you're saying because he had the gun in his hand, he had a zoned out look in his eye, the decision was made to shoot because they didn't know what he was going to do.
It's a justified shooting based on the totality of the circumstances. The gun that he goes, when officers come, he draws the gun. He doesn't keep it in his holster. He doesn't put it on the floor. He draws the gun. He's told numerous times to drop the gun. He then gets out and doesn't turn to run away from officers. He turns toward them with a look. I don't know if it's from medication. I don't know if that's his look. I don't know, Mr. Scott. But assessing, looking at each, and then focuses back on Officer Vinson. Our determination is that at that time, his belief was reasonable, that he was an imminent threat of death or the death of his fellow officers, and he was justified in shooting.
Follow up, any medical experts talk to you about that drug and what that...
The investigators did talk to medical experts. Really, the medical has nothing to do with the analysis since Officer Vinson and none of the officers knew about the medical. So it's the scene and what occurs. It's that split second and everything surrounding that decision.
The officers said they saw marijuana, and that seems to have been one of the reasons that they approached him in the first place. Why was there no test in the toxicology report for marijuana?
First of all, the blunt was tested. It was marijuana. The bottle, the prescription bottle or the empty yellow bottle, had residue that was marijuana. And a later test was done, and Mr. Scott did test positive for recent consumption of marijuana.
Where is that information? It was not in the toxicology report.
It was not in the toxicology report. The SBI asked for it late, and it came after the toxicology report.
Can you tell us more about the conversation this morning with the family, how they reacted?
The family was extremely gracious. We were there with their attorneys. They wanted us to go through the facts of the case, the evidence. We started with the presentation basically that I'm providing you. And initially they had a few questions, but then they just said, well, let's not interrupt. You go through what you say, and then we'll go back and ask questions. And it was a difficult conversation for everybody. But we went through the evidence. They understood our position, and it lasted a little over an hour, and they were gracious. The family was extremely gracious.
Did they seem to accept the decision?
They didn't say whether they accept or not. They have attorneys with them. They just were very gracious in their discussions with us.
Why was Officer Vinson the only officer to fire shots?
Our determination is what occurs and whether it was justified shooting, lawful. Okay, I can't tell you as to whether other officers did or not do. That is the tactics, the procedures of other officers. I will tell you, and if you did not hear, I apologize that the sound is not loud. Officer Vinson indicates that himself or another was about to be shot, and that he had a clear backdrop. There were no witnesses behind him. There were no blue. To blue is another officer. There was no friendly fire behind him. So that he had a clear shot at that time.
Mr. Crump?
How many pieces of evidence, how many interviews were conducted in this case, and how many reports were submitted by the FBI?
I'm looking at multitudes. I just told you 63 SBI agents touched it, over 2,300 hours. This office has put in hundreds of hours into this case. As to the number of pieces of evidence, I've reviewed every one of them, but we don't have a count on a spreadsheet that says how many pieces of evidence or how many pieces of paper we have. A lot of it comes in dribs and drabs, right? While they do reports, they bring it in for us to review. And really, everyone always calls, when are you going to be done? When's the analysis done? When's the SBI going to have the full report? Well, a full report's not really until we determine. A lot of times we'll say, we want something else analyzed, and it takes a while. Or we want a witness re-interviewed. Or we want them to go find a witness that said something on YouTube that we'd like them to find. So it's really not done until we determine we have everything and we can come to a conclusion.
Is there some frustration as a prosecutor that just because no one saw a gun on the video, that there was this immediate assumption that there was no gun, and you had to spend 45 minutes giving us all of this information to counteract the fact that there was just not any evidence seen on the video?
Well, I'd like to have video that shows everything, and so then we would not have been in this situation. But when you talk about frustration, this city had a reaction that now when you look at the evidence, and if we would have taken that collective pause and provided an opportunity for an investigation to happen, I think it would have been a different scenario. Yes, sir. Sorry.
What is the status now, pardon me if you expressed this already, what is the status now of a separate SBI investigation and report relative to this one? Does this conclude?
It concludes it. Initially, CMPD started the investigation, then we asked the family if they wanted the SBI to review or to be the investigative agency. When they said yes, CMPD is completely out. We have no more discussions. We have no interaction. SBI took it, verified what they have. The SBI came to the conclusion that there was nothing in the initial CMPD that was manipulated, that was changed, and the SBI's report from there, it's concluded as of today.
And just one more thing.
Yes, sir.
I think you did a good job on that, and I really appreciate the way that you explained it. But would you agree that in the future that we should reverse the law? If we got video from the police action that the public would see, I think if the public would have saw where he had this gun when he went inside the store, and all when we was asking, please turn over the video. Please turn over the video. If that been turned over earlier, a lot of riot and stuff would have happened.
No, sir.
You don't think that would happen?
No, sir. I just cannot agree with you that all the evidence has to be in. Now, if I had definitive evidence early on in the investigation, if the videos were clear from several angles, if I had everything that could say that whether we're going to charge the officer or whether we are not going to charge the officer, then we'll make that decision early. But this required an investigation, a deep investigation. It required us to find those things and to bring them to light. So, no, I would not say that. I would say that let me do the analysis. If I can make that decision in a week based on extremely strong evidence and video, then I'll make that decision in a week. But I'm going to make sure that I make the decision where we take the time, where we're meticulous, where we're thorough, and that we do justice. Because our job is to do justice every time.
And I'm talking about the future, not just this case, but in the future. If you got video where a police officer did a violation and you see it there, that the public or the press would automatically be able to get it filed for freedom of information. You don't think that that's the right thing to do?
No, sir. My job is to do justice in this community, and just one video is not going to do justice for this community. This community needs to know the facts, the real facts. Because in this case, there was a lot of things that were not correct.
I agree with you.
Next question.
The person that sold the gun to Mr. Scott, that person, would you say they cooperated, and is that person facing any charges or going to face charges?
That person is from Gaston County. It was a group. It was the SBI. It was the Gaston County Police. It was alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. It was also apparently a probation officer. And so that person's from Gaston. I do not know the status of that person being charged, whether federal or state, since that didn't occur here. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Have we ever identified the person who was the initial subject that was there to be investigated? There's a question about that prior to whether has that person been apprehended or served?
I do not know. I'm looking at my SBI agents. I do not know if he was ever apprehended. That really wasn't part of this investigation. They were just there for a fugitive, trying to locate a fugitive, and then this case became this case. I'm getting no nods, so I don't think anyone knows whether he was from SBI.
Some speculation that officers unnecessarily escalated this situation in the run-up to this shooting. I know this isn't your purview, but any thoughts on how officers handled things before the shooting actually happened?
I'm not going to speculate. There's been enough speculation in this case. My job is simply to analyze the evidence as presented and make a determination, and Officer Vinson's actions were lawful.
Katie, can you share with us the context of the text conversation between the Scotts when Mrs. Scott said that she didn't know that he had a gun?
We will. It will be online later today. We will provide it. Anything that we relied upon, we are linking, and you'll be able to see it and read it.
You mentioned earlier that people have been asking, why is this taking so long? Have you been under political pressure? Have you talked to the governor, the mayor? Who's been asking you to hurry up?
I have not been under any political pressure other than the family, obviously, and the attorney wanted it concluded. Myself, I wanted to do this as carefully, as meticulously as possible, but also this community needs closure. This case needed to be concluded. So we put a lot of time and hours into this case to make certain that we got it done as expeditiously as possible, but thoroughly, meticulously, and making sure that we got it right.
Did you keep the governor's office or the mayor's office updated?
I kept the governor's office, I informed the governor last week that there's a possible decision this week if he needed to know that, and I informed the governor this morning after leaving the family that I would be having a press conference. That's the extent of two conversations.
I'm sorry, are you guys going to share your findings or at least parts of this investigation with CMPD as they continue with their internal affairs program?
That's a good question. I'm not certain since it's SBI, it's no longer ours. We're no longer the custodian. We will facilitate the family and the family attorneys getting the investigation from SBI. So the family will have it. As to CMPD and theirs, I take it through interagency. They will be able to work that out.
Sorry, Mr. Murray, one more question, because I know you can't identify exactly what it was. Can you say what type it was?
It's not that I can't identify. It really wasn't part of this analysis. We have it, we reviewed it, but it's not part of this analysis, so it's not pertinent to our decision. So I just won't be discussing it other than he had a psychiatric disorder and was on significant medications.
You mentioned text between Mr. and Mrs. Scott about the gun. Can you give any details? They argued about a gun. Are there any details of those texts that you can give us?
Between Mr. Scott and Mrs. Scott. You're going to see it. It was discussion apparently where he says some indication like, can he come home? She's asking him about the gun. He asked her about, do you know how much time I can get for that gun? And it's just a conversation surrounding the gun between him and his wife. You're going to see it this afternoon.
You characterize whether she
I don't want to characterize. I don't want to mischaracterize it. It will be on this afternoon. You'll be able to review it. I'm being told the question about medications. A list of the medications is in the report, so you'll be able to see the list of the medications.
I believe you said there were previous Gaston County warrants out.
Correct.
Is that correct? What were those related to the gun? What were those related to?
You know, you guys actually are the ones that published his record. So his record's there. There was some assaultive behavior that he had warrants out for in Gaston County.
Is there a separate SBI report on this, or is that part of what you're making public? If not, can we get a hold of it?
The SBI provides us with a report. We have put all pertinent information that we relied upon. We're going to publish it. We've linked it. However, you're not getting the entire file. There's obviously there's private information. There's private medical information. There's private information. We had a cell phone. Well, the cell phone's pretty private, right? There's a lot of things on there that don't need to be disclosed. So we're disclosing in responsible transparency everything we relied upon. The rest will go back to the SBI, and Mrs. Scott and their attorneys will get the entire file.
If the wife knowingly misled investigators, could she face charges?
If the wife, say that again?
If the wife knowingly misled investigators, could she lie?
I have no indication that she knowingly misled investigators. There certainly, when somebody is emotional, when they have other things going on, this was a tragic event. I don't see us pursuing any charges like that, if that's what you're asking.
That's all the time that Mr. Murray has for questions. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. If you don't have my contact information, please see me. I have a card. In a few minutes, we'll be publishing a report online on our website. It has the photos and videos that you've seen today, as well as additional evidence that's hyperlinked in the report. You'll be able to find that at charlotte-mecklenburg.com on our news releases page. And we'd also like your help in communicating to the public that the DA's office will answer their questions. If people read the report and have questions, we ask them to email us at community@charlotte-mecklenburg.com. Obviously, it will take us some time to respond to everyone, but we think it's important to answer questions directly. Thank you for being here.